Beneath the roaring flight deck of a U.S. aircraft carrier lies a world few ever see. Here, far removed from the sunlight and spectacle of aircraft launches, is a labyrinth of metal, machinery, and relentless purpose. To the untrained eye, it may resemble an underground bunker, tight passageways, dim lighting, and walls lined with warning signs. To the crew, it's home, workplace, and a battlefield in waiting. It's here that the truth behind the so-called underground tunnels begins to take shape, not as myth, but as the arteries of the Navy's most formidable warships. Petty Officer Marcus Reed had never been claustrophobic until he was assigned below deck. At 26, Reed was an aviation ordnance man stationed aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, the Navy's newest and most advanced carrier. His job: move, load, and monitor the ship's vast arsenal of weapons, all of which had to pass through the sealed, armored corridors running deep inside the hull. These weren't tunnels in the civilian sense. They were strategic conduits, metallic veins feeding the lifeblood of the carrier's air wing. Reed's shift began before sunrise. Clad in flame-resistant gear, he descended several decks down, past the hangar, past the mess, down to the weapons magazine. There, beneath layers of blast-resistant bulkheads, lay row upon row of bombs, missiles, and classified payloads. Some were stored behind biometric locks, others in pressurized vaults. In the unlikely event of a breach, these lower compartments were designed to contain the explosion and sacrifice themselves to save the ship. It was here that the tension first surfaced. Rumors had been circulating. An unidentified submarine had been detected shadowing the carrier group. Officially, there was no threat. Unofficially, the entire crew knew better. Drills had increased. Orders were terse. And for Reed, who spent most of his time shuttling high-explosive ordnance through narrow hallways in automated elevators, the tension was tangible. Across the carrier, Lieutenant Julia Morgan monitored activity from the Combat Information Center. Morgan, a former systems engineer turned naval officer, was one of the few who understood the complexity of what lay beneath. The so-called underground tunnels weren't just for storage. They were defensive in nature, designed to distribute vital systems, power, communications, munitions, so that no single strike could cripple the vessel. If the bridge were lost, command could be transferred below. If flight ops were disabled, the ship could still fight back using surface-to-air and cruise missile systems, all controlled through pathways winding under thousands of tons of steel. Morgan had spent months studying the ship's schematics. She knew that below the waterline, the Ford was an engineering masterpiece. But knowing that and trusting it were two different things. Her mind drifted to Exercise Triton, a simulated missile strike conducted 6 months prior. In that drill, a penetrating hit to deck 3 forced command to transfer to an auxiliary control center 3 decks lower. The transition was smooth on paper. In reality, it nearly collapsed under communication lag and personnel confusion. If it had been a real strike, they might not have recovered in time. Now, with a foreign sub prowling nearby, those same protocols were being quietly reviewed. Below deck, Reed received a classified crate, unmarked, unusually cold to the touch. He was told only to transport it to subdeck compartment 7B and not to ask questions. This wasn't standard protocol. Even for an aircraft carrier tasked with carrying a variety of weapon systems, this crate stood out. He nodded, not out of agreement, but out of instinct. In the Navy, you follow first, question later. As he maneuvered the crate through one of the lowest passages, the ship's klaxon blared, briefly. Not a full alert, just a pulse, enough to raise heart rates. Moments later, a voice came through the ship's internal comms. All stations, remain at readiness condition yellow. This is a systems test. Everyone knew it wasn't just a test. Reed reached the compartment and keyed in his access. The door opened, revealing a room bathed in pale blue light and humming with temperature controls. A tech officer waited inside, clipboard in hand. No names were exchanged. The crate was passed off, the door sealed, and Reed retraced his steps, uneased. Above, Morgan received encrypted telemetry updates. The unidentified contact had closed within 40 nautical miles before abruptly changing course. No direct engagement, but the implications were clear. The Ford was being watched. Whether by a rival power or a test of its stealth systems, no one could say. And while flight ops and radar handled the visible threat, Morgan knew that any real engagement would challenge the carrier's deepest defenses, those running through its so-called tunnels. At the evening briefing, the captain addressed the bridge crew. "We don't rattle," he said. "We prepare. This ship was built for more than flight decks and dogfights. What lies below, the systems, the people, that's what keeps us alive. That's where the fight really begins." In the days that followed, nothing overt occurred. No alarms, no missiles, no headlines. But the crew moved with sharper purpose. Maintenance logs below deck were triple-checked. Electrical relays and communication redundancies were tested in real time. Reed noticed new surveillance units being installed in the ammunition tunnels, silent, unmarked, but watching. Morgan's access logs showed unexpected scans of classified compartments she'd never visited. Somewhere in those corridors, past layers of steel and secrets, something had been activated. Whether in response to a threat or in preparation for one, neither Reed nor Morgan could say. But both understood one thing clearly now. The real power of a U.S. aircraft carrier doesn't live in the jets. It launches into the sky. It lives in the depth of what lies beneath. And that world, that hidden layer of machinery, nerve, and vigilance, was now fully awake. The lights flickered once in the compartment deep below the flight deck, and Marcus Reed froze mid-step. A subtle shudder ran through the hull, barely perceptible but unmistakable to those who lived with the ship's rhythms. Something had changed. He set down the diagnostic tablet and listened, not to the klaxons or voices, but to the ship itself. Every carrier had a voice if you knew how to hear it. This one today was whispering warnings. Up above in the Combat Information Center, Lieutenant Julia Morgan was already reviewing an anomaly. A momentary break in the carrier's encrypted internal network, just a flicker, less than a second, but enough to raise flags in systems designed to detect intrusions at the speed of thought. The source was internal, somewhere below deck, somewhere deep. Reed's workspace was in what sailors informally called the maze, a warren of compartments that wound through the lower decks, some just wide enough for one person at a time. Here, amid the weapons lifts and redundant control terminals, he was assigned to monitor ordnance transport for readiness drills. But lately, his duties had expanded without explanation. New storage codes, unusual routing orders, a growing list of unexplained anomalies. That day's assignment was even stranger. Inspect a seemingly dormant fire suppression node in compartment 5R. It wasn't in his usual route, and the node itself hadn't reported a fault. But the request had come from high-level command, sealed under Level 3 clearance. He wasn't supposed to know it, but he did, because Reed, unlike most of his peers, had once studied electronic systems diagnostics before enlisting. And while he lacked Morgan's access, he had something almost as valuable: intuition. Compartment 5R was cold, not just air-conditioned, chilled. The kind of chill that suggested refrigeration rather than simple cooling. Inside, the node looked perfectly ordinary, a circular array of valves and sensors mounted to a sealed pipe junction. But its internal log showed something unusual. It had been activated for precisely 0.6 seconds at 0300 hours that morning. Not long enough to deploy foam or gas, but long enough to send a signal. Reed noted the timestamp and cross-checked it against his previous delivery. The strange crate, the blue-lit compartment, the unspoken tension. Something was connecting the dots behind their backs, and he wasn't alone in thinking it. Morgan, back in the CIC, had already isolated the system glitch to a set of subnet relays routed through Deck 6, a known auxiliary data pathway that often doubled as a backup control channel in wartime scenarios. It shouldn't have been active. But it was, and its output was bouncing through a series of old decommissioned ports. Someone or something was using the carrier's internal systems in ways they weren't designed for. Or perhaps, Morgan mused, in ways they were designed for, but not revealed. Her report was met with stiff nods and curt acknowledgments. "Classified update," her commander said, eyes on the screen. "Don't follow this further unless directly tasked." But Morgan had already followed it further. She had traced the anomaly back to a secure sector beneath the engine room, compartment X2. A section supposedly housing inert electrical routing, yet showing intermittent power draws in precise rhythmic patterns. It didn't match cooling cycles. It didn't match radar sweeps. But it did match something. Encrypted communications protocols, ones she'd studied during her time as a civilian systems analyst. Meanwhile, Reed's routine had shifted into something more like surveillance. He was being watched more carefully. His logs reviewed. A superior officer, usually casual and approachable, now questioned his every route. One morning, a non-regulation security detail appeared at his locker. 2 men, faces unreadable, asking about his shift changes and if he'd noticed anything unusual. He lied, and they left, but not without searching his datapad. The ship had secrets. That wasn't surprising. But what began as an impression was becoming something undeniable. USS Gerald R. Ford was operating under a layered protocol that even most of its own crew weren't privy to. Then came the incident. At 0217, the entire carrier briefly lost lighting on decks 4 through 6. Backup systems kicked in within seconds, but not before dozens of internal access points rebooted simultaneously. Logs were scrambled, internal comms were locked, and in that brief blackout, Compartment 5R's fire node activated again, this time for 3 seconds. Cameras went dark, doors auto-sealed. When light returned, 2 compartments adjacent to it had been emptied of their contents. No records, no explanation. Morgan knew what that meant. The node wasn't just a fire system. It was a trigger, some kind of internal switch, perhaps one of many, designed to activate deeper operations hidden beneath routine activity. Reed suspected the same, though he lacked the clearance to confirm it. What he did have was a hard copy of the original crate manifest. He'd printed it before it was redacted from the network, and buried in the fine print was a name: Project Depthstone. No one aboard dared say what that meant, but in the days that followed, both Morgan and Reed noticed something unsettling. Orders were more encrypted. Patrols grew more frequent in the lower decks. Entire corridors were declared off-limits without warning. And some crew members, usually the quiet, technical ones, began disappearing from daily logs. The carrier was at sea, calm waters, routine operations, no visible threat on radar. But something was stirring within, something dormant, or perhaps deliberately hidden. Morgan watched her system monitors with newfound urgency. Reed moved more carefully through the tunnels, never sure when the floor beneath him might lead somewhere he wasn't supposed to see. And above them all, the Gerald R. Ford sailed on, a steel giant cloaked in sunlit authority, its true nature buried far below, in chambers where light rarely touched and secrets were welded into the bulkheads. The silence was different now. Not the quiet of machinery humming in harmony, nor the pause between drills. This was heavier, coiled, restrained. Marcus Reed moved with measured steps through the narrow service corridor beneath the flight deck, his eyes scanning for movement, his ears attuned to the shift in pressure and vibration. He wasn't just on edge. He was being hunted. It had been 48 hours since the blackout. 48 hours since Compartment 5R had triggered that unknown protocol, since encrypted files had been purged, and since his name had appeared on a restricted personnel log he was never meant to see. Since then, the rhythm of the carrier had changed. Patrols in areas that had once been dormant. Crew rotations shuffled. Access permissions revoked without explanation. People like Reed, the curious ones, were being quietly isolated. Lieutenant Julia Morgan had not returned to her usual station. Word was she'd been reassigned, permanently. But Reed knew better. Her terminal had been scrubbed, her logs erased, and a new junior officer now filled her post, oblivious or pretending to be. But Reed had her data. She had given it to him, compressed and encoded, tucked away in a diagnostics log and renamed as a coolant flow chart. It had taken hours to decrypt. What he found confirmed his fears and added new ones. Project Depthstone wasn't just a hidden protocol, it was a secondary command structure, a ghost system. Beneath the USS Gerald R. Ford's highly visible, highly regulated command layers, Depthstone operated like a parasite. It piggybacked on the carrier's systems, activating compartmentalized operations through nondescript nodes like the one in 5R. And its design pointed to something staggering: intelligence gathering beyond the battlefield. The carrier wasn't just a ship, it was a floating surveillance array, capable of running autonomous collection missions without direct human oversight. Reed traced Depthstone's nodes across the ship, each hidden in systems with plausible functions: environmental sensors, backup fire suppression, degaussing control. None stood out alone, but together they formed a lattice of concealed data pathways and command prompts. And more troubling, they were active, pulsing quietly in intervals too precise to be random. It wasn't just a defensive measure, it was being used. Someone aboard was running silent missions beneath the surface of the Navy's most powerful warship, and no one with visible authority seemed aware, or they were pretending not to be. That night, Reed returned to Compartment 5R. He knew he was on borrowed time. If Depthstone had been alerted to his probing, the next lockdown might not end with just erased logs. He reached the node and opened its manual override port, a move strictly prohibited but necessary. The moment he did, the system flared to life, not with sirens or alarms, but with light. A screen blinked to life on the inner wall, a screen that hadn't existed before. It displayed nothing but a series of words in block text. Protocol active. Observer present, do not interfere. Then it blinked off. The bulkhead behind him unlatched with a hiss, revealing a narrow stairwell leading deeper into the carrier. This wasn't on any schematic Reed had seen. It led below the ballast tanks, into areas supposedly filled with maintenance infrastructure. Against his better judgment, he descended. What he found felt more like a bunker than a passageway. The space was reinforced, cooled, and eerily sterile. Consoles lined the walls, some dark, some blinking in quiet cycles. A single chair faced a large, curved panel showing not tactical maps or ship schematics, but world geography, marked in coded overlays, trade routes, communication nodes, civilian shipping data. It was a nerve center, but not for warfighting, for monitoring. A noise behind him made him spin around. A woman stood there, calm, dressed in standard Navy fatigues, but lacking any visible insignia. Her eyes held no surprise, only certainty. "You shouldn't be here, Specialist Reed," she said evenly. "Then maybe someone should explain what this is," Reed replied, motioning to the wall of maps. "It's above your clearance." "Then why haven't you reported me already?" She paused. "Because you're not the first to find it, and you won't be the last." Reed narrowed his eyes. "So this is it? A black program hidden in plain sight?" "No," she said. "This is the insurance policy, the layer that exists when command fails, when visibility is a liability, when knowing is more dangerous then acting. Reed stared at her. How many people know about this? Enough to keep it running. Few enough to deny it exists. And Morgan? He asked. She chose the system. She's safe, in a way. You mean locked down, he muttered. The woman stepped closer. You've seen enough to understand what we're doing here, but not enough to stop it. That's your choice now. Reed looked at the console again. A message blinked onto the screen, addressed simply, "Accept assignment or erase trace." He didn't answer. Not yet. As he turned to leave, the woman didn't stop him. He climbed the stairs slowly, his mind racing. The carrier still moved with the ocean, its engines humming, its flight deck bustling. But below that, deep in its hull, something else pulsed, something not entirely under Navy control. A program within the program, watching, recording, waiting. Back in his quarters, Reed sat in silence, the encrypted drive in his hand. He could go back to his duties, pretend ignorance, or he could make a choice. One that wouldn't just shape his future, but perhaps determine who truly controlled the most powerful ship at sea. And far below, in the quiet dark, the system waited.